All right, we're going to get started. Um, so we won't do formal introductions. We'll sort of let people introduce themselves as they answer their first question, but just to give a quick rundown of who's in the room, so to speak. My name is Sylvia Scharf. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the moderator. I'm the climate education specialist for the Environmental Solutions Initiative at MIT. And we are joined by Margaret Wang from SubjectToClimate, Dr. Lauren Madden from the College of New Jersey, and Alice Fan from Spring Forward. And they'll be bringing three really distinct and interesting perspectives to this conversation around what can be done to really support and grow climate change education in K-12 classrooms in the United States. And I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the problem as we see it, and the challenge, some of the challenges that we've been seeing in this space. Really, the challenge is one of a disconnect between the fact that Americans, generally speaking, agree that schools should be teaching about climate change. Youth know that climate change is real and human caused. Teachers agree that climate change should be taught in school at even higher rates than the general public. And yet most teachers do not teach about climate change in their classrooms. And the reasons for this are really varied. They fall into a lot of different spaces, and that's what we'll be talking about over the next few, over the next hour. And the solutions to those challenges, they exist. We have some. We can create more, and we really want to sort of dive into that question of what is that the source of that disconnect between the fact that most Americans really do want climate change to be being taught in schools, but many students manage to get all the way until an environmental science course in high school that's an elective before they really are learning about climate change in school. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody's faces. And again, what I'd love to do is with this first question, give each person also an opportunity to sort of introduce themselves and their organization's work. So the first question really is just, how do you see the challenge of climate change education in K-12 education? What are you seeing from educators? What are you seeing from whoever your sort of constituency is around those challenges? And a little bit organization or the work that you're doing is tackling that problem. And Margaret, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. So my name is Margaret, and I'm one of the co-founders of SubjectToClimate, and currently the COO. And SubjectToClimate is a nonprofit organization that connects all K-12 educators of all subjects to credible and engaging resources on climate change. So when we first started our organization, I think it's exactly the question that Sylvia asked. We asked several teachers, what are the barriers that you're facing when you want to teach about such an important topic in your classroom? And it's very consistent to also what Sylvia had shared, where predominantly teachers mentioned it just didn't fit into their curriculum. Having been a teacher, we know that we have to get through a lot of standards. Some of us have to teach to standardized tests, and we're just accountable for so many different things for our students to learn. So all across the board, when we hear teachers talk about why they are not teaching about climate change, we hear that we don't have the time in our classroom and in our curriculum to do that. But I also wanted to point out a couple of other challenges that teachers are facing. This actually comes from a recent report from Take Action Global at Shift Sustainability and EarthDay.org. And they looked at a global perspective of challenges with climate change education. And there were 5 key themes around it. The first one, which I thought was really interesting, is that there was inconsistent climate terminology, which created a barrier for collaboration. So those who are thinking, sustainability education, climate change education, or there was just so many terminology when there is overlap, and it kind of breaks down the opportunities for educators to collaborate, which is very powerful. And the second thing they identified was that there just needs to be more resources to provide educators with sufficient information, and educators needing more support from local and national policymakers. And so those were some of the findings that from the latest report. But I'll go ahead, Sylvia, and pass it on to somebody else to also talk about different perspectives.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome, Margaret. Lauren, speaking of the policy side, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you've been working on.
Thank you so much for having us, Sylvia. I'm excited to be here. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a faculty member at the College of New Jersey, which is a small public primary undergraduate institution in central New Jersey. And we are very strategically located right near Trenton, our state capital. So as you may know, New Jersey became the first state in the US to integrate climate change standards across all grade levels and subject areas, which they're technically the 2020 standards, but they rolled out this September. So we actually we have an opportunity to see what's going on in classrooms where climate change is part of what needs to be taught. So these are standards, they're not curriculum, which is a little bit different. In New Jersey, every school and district has unique control over what the curriculum is, but the standards are what guide the decisions of what topics and ideas are included in the classrooms. So I've been lucky enough to sort of work along the way as these standards were launched and the policy sort of came into action here in New Jersey. And we're right at the front edge right now. So I'm an educational researcher. So I've been doing some research in partnership with others, including Margaret, looking at how teachers feel about integrating climate change into their classrooms and parents' perspectives as well, and sort of seeing what's happening as this is rolling out. And I have to say, from the teachers I work with personally, I've seen some really incredible things happening in classrooms across the grade span. I'm most concerned about the youngest kids, the K to 5. I'm in an elementary education department here, so that's sort of where my heart is. But we've had some really hopeful news. We've seen some really wonderful things. And I guess the concern I have moving forward is one that's been shared by teachers and parents alike in our state, is making sure that we're really hitting these standards in a developmentally appropriate way, and we're being mindful of mental health concerns that could come about talking about tragic events that can happen as a result of climate change. So I think on that note, I'm gonna stop and let Sylvia pass this on to somebody else.
Wonderful. And Alice, I really appreciate your perspective, both as a student and as a fellow educator, working with younger students. So I'd love to hear sort of what you're seeing from the youth perspective.
Yeah, I'm Alice. I use she, her pronouns. I helped to create a youth climate education organization called Spring Forward about 2.5 years ago. And since then, we've reached like 2,000 students. We've taught over 200 workshops, and over time, we've created and implemented curriculum in schools and summer camps and youth programs. We also partner with organizations like Mass Audubon and the Woodwell Climate Research Center to bring teacher trainings and also to write policy briefs for a younger audience. And I think the challenge with climate education is, I think in middle school, I learned about climate change because it was affecting the polar bears or the glaciers were melting, which are all very valid causes of climate change or why we should be concerned. But when I got to high school, I started joining these youth climate movements outside of school, and I started learning that climate change is in fact very systemic, and its effects are unequal, and its effects are affecting humans like right now. And I think that's something that not a lot of my peers understand or fully internalize. And so one of the ways Spring Forward helps to combat this issue is to directly go into schools and where the youth are, and to talk about things like climate justice and the climate science, and less focus on individual action like recycling and composting, but also more of the systemic level changes.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a through line through what all three of you were talking about around this issue of finding the place where it fits. And both making that place, whether it be an out of school time or other opportunities, or whether it be by changing standards and things like that. And that's something that in my role at the Environmental Solutions Initiative, I've been really thinking about, because we produce, materials for teachers to use, our educator guides, and then also produce our explainers and our podcast that are aimed at a general audience, but absolutely can be used by teachers for self-teaching, right? To address that issue that Margaret, that you mentioned, of not feeling like you necessarily have the content to bring this topic forward in your classroom. And many of these are, these are all really great solutions that are kind of all happening from a lot of different angles. And I'd love to hear a couple of stories that people have of sort of innovative solutions or innovative stories you've seen of how climate change has been brought into a place where it wasn't being taught previously, be that either at a younger grade, in a different subject area, or a different context. And I think for this one, Lauren, I'd love to start with you.
So innovation, I think that's such a great way to think about climate change education. In fact, I think that's the mindset that we really need to have, is making sure that we're thinking about creative solutions that happen really on the limits of human capabilities, right? We want to make sure that when we're talking to kids, it's not just those sad polar bears, right? I mean, that's usually the first thing that comes to mind. One of the best things that I've seen was we did a series of workshops with teachers in New Jersey a while back about marine science and climate change in K-8 classrooms. And one of the first things we did was really just get to know our place, taking a good nature walk, having that, which doesn't really sound so innovative, right? Taking a nature walk, using things like the Seek app to figure out which plants are there and whether they're native or invasive. And if they're invasive, putting on your gloves and pulling them out. And as silly as that sounds, but if you're working with a group of third graders, like some of the teachers that we were working with were, and you go outside and you find this invasive plant, which is thriving because the climate has changed and it's being able to adapt in an environment where it's not supposed to be. And you give those third graders some gloves and you let them pull those plants out. That's really an empowering way to think about taking some action and not being so worried, that we can identify a problem, identify a solution, and take action onto that solution. That makes things feel a little bit less scary, and that also lets kids see some of the opportunities that move ahead. So that would be one particular story of some of the teachers we worked with here in Central New Jersey not so long ago.
A great example also, because we also know that, research has shown that one of the best predictors of future environmental, sort of pro-environmental behavior in young people is time spent outside with a trusted adult. And if that time spent outside is pulling up knotweed, or whatever it is that has grown in along that path, that's a great way to get those kids literally with their fingers in the dirt. Alice, I'd love to hear something that you've either done yourself or experienced or seen.
Yeah, it's really funny you mentioned that, Dr. Madden, because I'm not necessarily an adult, but I actually went on a nature walk with 3rd to 5th graders yesterday as part of sort of some programming for Spring Forward. So yes, nature walks 100%. Another sort of lesson plan that's really popular in Spring Forward we found is this climate justice monopoly. So we essentially took a Monopoly game, we put it on a Google Sheet, and we changed a lot of the chance cards and community chest cards. So, and we also changed the board. So essentially the poor properties live near a landfill or a factory. And so we put little icons there. And then as you move up the property value spectrum, the most expensive properties are in suburbs. And we put a little palm tree emoji. And the chance cards go something along the lines of, if a heat wave goes, hits your neighborhood, if you live near a landfill or marsh, for example, where there might be a little bit more concrete, you must pay a fine. If you don't live near those areas, then you're fine. And so I think this game has really it's been wildly popular. I think whenever I teach it, at least, the kids are always like, oh, like we want more, like we want to continue playing, because Monopoly can seriously go on and on and on. But I think it really lets kids go into this mindset of like, okay, like what decisions do I need to make if I live in a community that's more affected by climate change? I mean, everyone starts out with an unequal amount of money, so everyone is forced to buy a property that sort of fits with their income level. And it's like, well, do I have enough money to buy a benefit, a car? It's sort of like the utilities railroad thing of the real Monopoly game. Or should I just risk it? And if a chance card comes along and I don't have a car to run away from a tornado, then I have to pay a fine. And so I think it's these decisions that have like real life implications, but are also set in a very fictional land of Monopoly. It's very familiar to everyone. I think has been really innovative for us. It also has allowed us to understand sort of what works for kids and how we can make climate justice, which is a very hard concept for all of us to understand, into a more realistic setting.
It's a great example, and Margaret, I'd love to hear from you, and then just so you're starting to think, we're also going to start talking about also how do we scale these things up, right? How do we get to the community level and the systemic, as you mentioned, Alice, the systemic issues that surround these challenges.
Thank you so much. And I love hearing all the examples that Alice and Lauren also talked about, because I think the innovations are happening in classrooms, with teachers being very creative on how they're teaching about climate change within their subject context. So when you think about innovative approaches on how to integrate climate change into what you already teach, one of the things is we're looking at the educational trends right now. And I think there is a lot on social emotional learning, which is very relevant to climate change. There's a lot of focus on literacy and numeracy, which actually has a lot to do with climate change, and climate change can be a topic that can really help students build literacy and numeracy skills, especially since students really want to learn about it. So if you're thinking about, as a teacher, how can I find an example that my students will actually start paying attention to? Climate change is one of the topics that you can use. And also social justice, as Alice mentioned, that there is a lot to be said in climate change regarding justice, with a lot of environmental justice and how communities are disproportionately affected. So with Subject to Climate, we have the privilege of working with teachers. And what we do is we actually have a teacher task force, and we work with current teachers who are teaching in various subjects. So they're experts in the subject that they teach. And they produce lesson plans that can really fit into that subject that you have to teach, and adding climate change elements. So there are so many, I think teachers are so creative. Again, they know what works in their classroom. They know an art teacher knows what they need to get through as an art teacher. An English teacher knows what they need to do to get through a high school English class. Similarly with other subjects. So we've seen really creative units in the arts where students are discussing and evaluating artwork by Joe Pelto, who's an amazing artist, and then demonstrating their learning of artistic techniques in writing and drawing. And we've seen math lesson plans where they're using data such as temperature data and really analyzing change over time, which we know is something that you have to learn about in math. There's also a great lesson plan from, I think, a high school lesson plan where they're using geometry to investigate how much sea levels would rise if Antarctica melted. So, it's geometric modeling and you have to teach about it, but this is something that could be more interesting for students. I've seen really interesting ELA lesson plans. This one is high school as well, where you're looking at the difference between odes and elegies, and you're looking at climate poetry. And then there's also so many civics, social studies, and even Spanish lesson plans. The one that I really love is actually from a teacher in New Jersey, and Lauren will know who I'm talking about. She was also covered by the Washington Post, but she did something really creative where she taught about the cardiorespiratory system and started with that, where they're learning about, the cardiorespiratory system and how climate change impacts it. And then they actually, in PE class, they're playing a game called Catch Your Breath, where some of the students are, playing the role of a tree, and then there's an atmosphere, and the balls are CO2 particles. And this is for a grade 3, 4, 5 class. And so it's very interactive. Alice talked about bringing people outside. It just really hits all these, and the kids are having fun, and then they're taking the time to debrief and learn about something. So if you think about those lessons that you remember years from now, I think that kind of counts as one of those lessons. The students will really, really absorb that. So the innovation are how teachers are already bringing it to their classroom. So our organization is really working and getting those lesson plans so other people can be inspired by that creativity that's already existing within the classroom.
Could I quickly add on to that? I really want to emphasize, Margaret, I really liked how you introduced the humanities in climate change. Spring Forward mostly focuses on elementary and middle school students because we are high school students after all. But as a high school student, I really appreciated when climate change and environmental issues are brought up in my humanities classes, because I think it goes to show how embedded environmental issues are like in the humanities and how we live and how we interact with the environment and how much our economy and like livelihoods and culture are all based on our natural environment. And so I just want to emphasize that climate change definitely has a place in the humanities and it's often overlooked.
Right. And just to respond to that, there was a youth panel in the Aspen Ideas Conference around climate change. And then I got the privilege to talk to a lot of youth who are very involved. I'm always so amazed how much youth are doing and educating other students about climate change. And when somebody asked them, what do you wish you could tell everybody else? I think one of the things they said is that we want to be taught about climate change in a way that's not just science focused, that if I had learned that it was at the core of it, it's about community and it's about caring, then I think that I would have it would have felt more approachable and I would have gotten involved more. So I just wanted to respond, Alice, to what you said.
Absolutely. I mean, climate change touches every part of human life, right? And therefore, there are connections in all subjects, involving climate change in teaching. It's one of the things that I've thought about when creating the educator guides for TIL Climate, Today I Learned Climate, our podcast, is really thinking about not just designing something that would be used in a high school environmental science AP environmental science classroom, though obviously I'm perfectly happy if that's how they get used as well. But really making those connections to the humanities, to civics, because this is one of the salient issues of our time, and therefore it networks into to everything. I did want to say to our audience, I've gotten a couple of questions have come into the Q&A, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. So please, as questions come up, feel free to drop those into that Q&A chat, and we will have time at the end for some of those questions. I'd love now to think a little bit more about the structural and systemic things that are impacting climate education, because a lot of the examples that we've talked about so far are what individual teachers are doing in the classroom. And I think, one of the ways we can affect change is by boosting those stories. And I think there's a lot of power in telling those stories and helping people see themselves in those stories. But there are also, all the inspiration in the world doesn't help if there are things that are structurally in your way. And so I'd love to think a little bit more about what those structural issues are and how different communities are overcoming those structural issues to make sure that climate change is being supported in schools. Lauren, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think you're absolutely right. And I think we can all think of examples from when we were students or as teachers or as community members of those superstar teachers who are activist mindset that are doing these these incredible things, but what's happening for everybody, right? I think there's a couple, so my suggestion is sort of twofold on both ends, kind of start bottom up and top down, that I think could possibly help. I think we have to let teachers start where they're at. We need to meet them where they are. And while I think totally revamping ideas about what school looks like and integrating climate into every topic and making sure that this is just sort of the culture of what happens in a classroom is the ideal, we might not get there right away if that's the place that we're looking for. And I do think that if in kindergarten you learn the difference between weather and climate really well when you're doing your weather charts, and then when you get to third grade and you're looking at maps of coastlines and you can see how those have changed over time, and then when you're in art class in fourth grade, and you're taking some time to look at different pieces of art that were created as a result of climate disasters, by the time you get to middle school, you really have primed the pump. And those little separate things, although I really do wish they were more connected across the board, each of those little small steps helps to lay a foundation. And that's really important. So I think if a teacher's only ready, a teacher who has a million things on her plate right now, if she's only ready to do one or two small things, that's okay, and that should still be celebrated. Because here's the other thing that happens in those situations. You give kids an opportunity to fall in love with the topic. And when a teacher sees his or her students' faces lighting up, that also is inspiring and motivating to help change things. So that's sort of the bottom-up direction I want to go in. And I have to say, I spend a lot of time in elementary school classrooms as part of my job. And I think it's really important that we're celebrating the times that these small steps are starting, because they really do help to build a foundation. The other side is really, let's give teachers some time. So there's a fabulous principal who, she might actually be on your teacher workforce here in New York. I'm gonna call her out. Her name's Jean Musey. She's at a K-3 school here in central New Jersey. And what she did that I thought was really brilliant was a team of teachers who were already doing a lot of really great project-based climate change work. What they did was they took a whole morning on a Friday and they took a whole grade level outside and did an extensive project-based learning activity. Then all of the teachers at all the other grade levels had time to be in their classrooms working together, looking for good places to integrate climate change across the curriculum, working collaboratively so that it wasn't one teacher's job to figure out what everyone else was doing and to really find good ways to do that. So this principal made sure that the kids were getting some really good climate ed and that the teachers were given the time and space they needed to do that kind of planning. And also allowing them to work in an individualized school-based environment so they could make sure that everything was connected to their place and related to what their kids' lives were like. I think we have to think a lot about those kinds of solutions and how are we encouraging our school leaders to think outside the box, to empower their teachers and give them the time and space that they need to make some of these changes. So I would say encouraging more of those kinds of actions would be really, really helpful, because it's great to send the superstars to a conference here and there, right? And they're already going to those conferences. But I think it's even more so impactful if you can really give teachers time and space to put their heads down and get to work.
Absolutely, and I'm already seeing quite a few questions coming into the Q&A for later, thinking about how do you get there, right? How do you get to the point where there is that level of school support, whether it's worries about pushback from the community or just already being so completely overwhelmed, teaching to the test, dealing with understaffing, underfunding, all of the issues that face, especially public schools, especially urban public schools, and thinking about that. And I'm also wondering, Margaret, I know that one of the things that SubjectToClimate has done is trying to sort of defracture the materials availability, right? We hear from teachers, I just don't know where to find things. and they know it's out there, but where do they find it? And I'd love to hear a little bit about what that process has been like of going and finding and gathering the materials so that they're available for teachers.
Yeah, so what was really interesting that when we first started Subject to Climate, we didn't know what we were gonna create. We actually asked a couple of teachers to share their screen and walk us through like, what do you do when you're trying to find X and Y and Z resource? And it starts with Google. It starts with typing a couple of phrases, and then you see the frustration when you get somewhere and then it doesn't fit into your classroom. You actually really can't find where it is. And then there is also that hesitation when there are terms that a teacher's not familiar with, that, oh, I don't know if I'm going to enter this space because I just don't know what these terms mean. But we did see a lot of frustration with like usability and just getting there and then just giving up. And then, when you don't have a lot of time and it completely makes sense, you're going to teach what you know best, and we know that most teachers and most people in general have not been taught about climate change. I certainly have not been taught about climate change back when I was a student. So that's the process that we see. But what it's also interesting is that we're seeing teachers more and more go outside of prescribed curriculum and looking for a lot of audio-visual supplements to make things interesting for students. I'm sure Alice knows more than anything that like right now, the generation, they're not gonna, like, maybe it's hard to capture attention and you want like, interactive medias. You want really fun, quick, snappy videos. You want quick podcasts. This is the type of media that students are consuming more than giving them a textbook, for example. So there's a disconnect. Teachers know what students want. They're trying to find it, but they're not getting there and they don't have time. So that's why we try to shortcut a lot of it and aggregate a lot of the resources. And Google is obviously very powerful, but we provide filters for teachers that make sense for teachers. So what subjects are you teaching? What grade level are you teaching? What standards are you teaching? What resource type? Are you looking for an article? Are you looking for data? Are you looking for interactive media? And I love the partnership with MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative. And on the side, we have a little bubble called Climate Socrates that you can write terminology and words, and then there's an article written by an MIT professor through the Ask MIT portal or Ask Climate portal, where you can get everything all in one place, which I think is just really helpful. But there are a lot of organizations that are now starting to provide that, and I think that's great because teachers are going to find resources anyway. And there's no one right way to find it. So as long as we are making it easier for them to enter that space, whatever capacity, then that's great. So that's kind of the experience of the everyday teacher trying to find that resource. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to make it easier.
And I think, there are so many different directions, right? So there's the policy side of changing standards, making it something that is actually required. And then there's the resource side of whether it's just then once it's required, finding the resources to make that. Because Lauren, you were saying earlier that in New Jersey, every school district determines their own curriculum. We're the same here in Massachusetts. So again, statewide standards, but curriculum varies district to district. And I'm also seeing a lot of questions coming into the chat about what about communities where one of the barriers is concern about community pushback. And then the flip side, and I'd love to sort of pair these two questions. One is, what about communities where there's concern about community pushback? The other is, how do schools and teachers harness the power of community to support climate change education? Because both of those things can be true sometimes in the same communities. And I'd love to hear both some sort of success stories of overcoming some of those barriers and also ways in which communities have come together to support climate change education outside of just what individual teachers or administrators are able to do. And whoever wants to take that one, go.
Sylvia, I missed the last part of your comment.
Yeah,
Not sure if
just
you
sort of
called on
trying to
something
think of
particular.
pairing both the question of how do schools or how do teachers deal in situations where they're concerned about community pushback on teaching climate change, and then the flip side of that also being how can teachers and schools and communities work together to support climate change communication. So if you are yourself not a teacher or an administrator, where is that support? So in both directions, how does the community both potentially be a barrier and potentially be a support to climate change education?
So I guess I can give an anecdote if that's okay, but I also have some other suggestions. So the workshops we were working on before, they're funded by the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium. And I mentioned earlier the wonderful success story of this third grade teacher who said, oh, we're going to do this in my schoolyard and pull out those plants and really let the kids feel empowered. There was one teacher who participated in all of our workshops, and at the very end said that she came to them because they were in person and outdoors, and that she was a climate change denier, and decided to come, and has completely changed her mind because we were nice to her and we fed her dinner and we didn't talk about anything that was argumentative in any sort of way. We just displayed factual information in a way that was factual. And I have to say, personally, I didn't think a teacher would choose to attend climate change education workshops if they were a denier. So it never even crossed my mind or my colleagues' minds that we would even talk about denial at those kinds of workshops. I just assumed everyone there was someone who wanted to learn more about it. But it really made me recognize that sometimes we just need to come to people with a little bit of kindness and factual information and let them come to things on their own. And the other side too, I think really getting what you said earlier in the call, getting to the innovation piece. So we can argue till the cows come home, right, about what scientific information is and what deniers have to say. But we can't argue that the solar energy and wind energy industries are going to grow and that we're going to get our power from different places in the future, right? Like if we're talking from an economic perspective, from a future perspective, that is an area that's growing. So maybe we start with talking about alternative energy and career prep type things with students in a place where there might be a little bit more pushback from the community. And then it's a conversation about innovation and preparing for future careers. And you can get climate change in the other way, right? I think that's everybody can come to the same page saying it's important to prepare children for future careers. So really looking at where are those places of common ground and starting there before we step outside into things that are considered by some to be politically charged. The other piece too is I think as teachers, we need to do a better job communicating with PTO organizations, community libraries, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and a lot of those kinds of places. There's really good motivation to do some climate advocacy type work and climate justice work as well. So maybe leveraging some more of those types of partnerships on organizations that are sort of in that Venn diagram overlapping with schools. Even before the bigger community. I think there's amazing examples, and I think my two colleagues probably have even better ones to talk about from engaging with the broader community, but the ones that are really closely connected to our schools, like Boys and Girls Clubs and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and PTOs, I think those are some really good places to continue building relationships. Sorry, I talked a lot. I'm going to turn my mute on now.
I'm gonna jump in. I think that this goes back to the sort of system level large scale solutions too. I think that community pushback can be maybe a little bit mediated if we just talk about if we just teach like the advocacy skills that are necessary to create change. Like it's not even like a partisan, like, oh, you should write your congressman in support of this particular bill. It's just like, how do you write a letter to your legislator, and how do you call them? And maybe like, how do you talk to your friends about climate change? Like, people don't know how to talk to other people about climate change, even among like my peers and other high school students. And I think giving them those skills that are sort of not really content driven, but like skills based, are really important, and also can be applied to like any other social issue besides climate change. So I think I would really advocate for teachers to focus on those too, because one of my teachers recently gave us a reading that essentially said, if you try to teach everything of importance, then essentially nothing is important. And I think if we try to teach about every single social issue and try to capture the importance of every single social issue on this planet, like that would be completely overwhelming and intimidating. But if we just focus on the advocacy skills that are necessary to learn about those issues, then people can explore the issues that they are most passionate about, or they want to learn more on their own time. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is again, like what Dr. Madden said, partnering with local organizations. I recently went to this workshop at a conference, and this organization was presenting one of their climate lessons, and they believe they're based in Worcester, in Massachusetts, and they essentially implement climate curriculum in elementary schools as well. And they literally took a map of Worcester and sort of mapped out like where it was previously redlined, and now like where are the trees most, or where is the highest concentration of trees. And if you just map up your local area, I thought it was really powerful when it's like literally, like what schools over there and what libraries over there, and who, these places and these people. And I think it humanizes the story a little bit when you focus on your local area and the local environmental issues that are affecting people that you yourself personally know. So yeah, just some thoughts, and also could be implemented on a large scale.
Right. And just to add on to that, like in terms of, Alice, you mentioned something really great. This is an opportunity to teach about advocacy and communication skills. I think the Yale program on climate change communication does a really effective job on sharing research on how to communicate about climate change across different populations. And I know that they had done a study, and they even created podcasts that had stories of different people experiencing issues from climate change. For example, there was I think a 1-minute podcast about somebody who hunts and was experiencing different migratory patterns, and they could no longer really predict when the birds would be coming. And that really hit home for people who maybe traditionally would not want to hear about what's going on with climate change. So at its root, it goes back to the question Sylvia said, like the community can also be an advantage to teach about climate change. So a couple of strategies in, the areas where you really can't, or you're scared to talk about climate change because of the repercussions, the politics. There's a couple of strategies. One, just again, going really rooted in the subject. So like, again, I'm not really teaching about it, but I am teaching about geometry. And this just happens to be an example where I'm using factual data to support it. And then number 2, Lauren had talked about workforce development is something really important to integrate when students are preparing for jobs in the future. And then 3 is looking at local effects and phenomenons. And maybe you're not specifically causing a lot of disruption in your school, but when you're taking your students and working with community-based organizations, going out field trips, doing observations, there are a lot of observations that are showing the effects of climate change in various communities. And we know that students are the key to changing parents and communities' minds. I know there was a paper in North Carolina that really showed that, a middle school class was able to really shift mindsets of their parents when it comes to climate change. So there needs to be that, similar to how there's a barrier between the resources out there and teachers, there is still a barrier between the community-based partner organizations and opportunities and schools. And I know that California has a the California Environmental Literacy Initiative, a great example is that they created the Kaylee Innovation Hub, where they've aggregated community-based partners, put them on an easy map so that educators can really easily see what are community-based partner field trip opportunities, or having them come into the classroom and really utilizing community. Again, bringing the students to look at local observations and phenomena is a really great way to teach about climate change, and you're just taking them on a field trip. So hopefully those are some ways to kind of bring climate change into the classroom.
These are really, really wonderful. What I'm going to do now is I think try to get to a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll do sort of a wrap up at the end. This time's gone very fast. So many wonderful ideas. One question that came in was around the issue of mental health, eco-anxiety, and resilience, and sort of the social emotional learning aspects of learning about climate change and teaching about climate change. And so I'd love to hear either an example that you've heard of, or something that you've witnessed that are really supporting the social emotional needs of students as they're learning about these massive issues. Alice, I think you had mentioned something a little earlier about how you think about through that when working with young students, especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, we're all children. I have a child. Like, we're talking to children here. One of the things that just off the top of my head that Spring Forward does is ultimately we just want people to have fun. And so during long lessons, sometimes I'll insert a Taylor Swift dance break as a fun way, because I personally am a huge fan, and I'm sure and people love dancing to shake it off. But I think also at the end of each Spring Forward lesson, on a more serious note, we do at the end of every lesson, we do make it a point to have like action items at the end. So a list of things that kids can do, that they can do like today, that might sort of help address the bigger problems at hand. So sometimes we'll have an individual action section. So we'll be like, talk to your friend about what you learned today, or bring back your drawing of the greenhouse gas effect and show it to people. But also we do, for part of the lesson, sometimes have like, okay, like, do you want to call your legislator? Like, or do you want to ask your principal to install solar panels on your house? Because we just learned about renewable energy, and now we know how awesome and cool it is, and now we want it here. And so I think things like that, and giving them tangible action items to do, might help alleviate, obviously I'm not an expert on this, but like alleviate a little bit of the anxiety and the stress that comes with learning such a difficult and broad topic that even I am still struggling to understand and to learn about. And so, yeah, I think also just having a positive attitude about it. Like we draw greenhouse gas diagrams and we listen to music while we're doing it, and we have fun and we chat, and really just connecting with them on a more human level in Spring Forward too is really important to us. So yeah, I obviously I don't I haven't done any research or anything into how this works, but I do know that we all have a fun time. That helps a lot.
Lauren, what have you seen either among your pre-service teachers or teachers you're working with in terms of supporting SEL?
So I really loved Alice's suggestions there. And I think it feels like the through line that's come for me so far in this conversation has been acknowledging the humanity of the people we're working with across the board. And that includes children. I think it's really important that we let kids know that we're not keeping things from them, and then we're not hiding and sugarcoating things. And as much as that might sound counterintuitive to the mental health side of things, it's important for kids to feel empowered and knowledgeable to be able to make actions. A colleague and good friend of mine here, who's a meteorologist, talks about, oftentimes when he's talking about climate change, he talks about, the progress humans have made with the hole in the ozone layer. And when I was growing up, that was one of the bigger environmental issues we talked about all the time. And through really good science and really good international collaboration and policies, we've actually minimized those effects tremendously over the last 20 or 30 years or so. So I think we need to make sure students know examples of times humans have done the right thing. And a lot of that was through political action and really good science and excellent communication and collaboration and all those skills that we need to build in the humanities to make sure that these kinds of policies come through in the future. And I think when you learn about things that are happening, that have happened in the past that were successful, that might motivate you to send that letter to your legislator. And I'm sorry, but 100 little first graders' letters sitting on a legislator's desk can make a difference and can make them think a little bit differently. And although it's not necessarily individuals' actions that can make the biggest difference, if you allow individuals to know ways they can take actions, it can allow them to feel empowered to inspire others to do the same. The other piece too is some of the innovation happening in engineering right now is so wild and out there. H&M is making clothing out of carbon from the air, that they are capturing carbon from the atmosphere and turning it into threads, which eventually become clothing. Now, I'm not into fast fashion, and I don't think it's a great idea to say that that's the only solution, but there are people who figured that out. And we need to tell kids about that all the time. They need to know there are people who are doing things no humans ever imagined before. And I think that that's part of the way that we keep the mental health burden a little bit lower.
Right, absolutely, Lauren. You talked about the inspiration that you get from what other people are doing, because I do think that it's really important for students to learn how they can take action as well. But I've heard from students that they also feel stressed because then they feel like the burden is on them, that we're like, hey, here's the problem and this is what you're going to do, good luck. And then the older generation stepping back, we want to do it in collaboration with them and treat them as equal partners as we move towards climate action. So in the lesson plans we work with teachers, we always have an inspire section, and it's not always the students taking action. There's a mixture of learning how other people are taking action or learning how to communicate to try to get others to take action together. But again, it's that key where you're also learning about what other people are doing, and showing like diversity of actions also helps the students feel that they're not alone in this together. One of the other things I think is really important is that we also have some of the teachers write guest posts on, some of the questions that come up, such as, are my students too young to learn about climate change? Or how do I address the different feelings about climate change? There was one written by a teacher in New Jersey named Yan Chu, and she talks about how it's okay to talk about their feelings, and holding space for the feelings to exist and having those conversations can be quite powerful. And it allows students to listen to each other, acknowledge that these feelings exist, and not for us to just dismiss it where it might fester into more anxiety. So creating and holding space for students is really important as well. And then another teacher from New Jersey talked about, how to address it with young children, that there's a range of things that, and we've talked about this throughout this webinar, that there are, another way to hold space for this is to also provide short opportunities for them to go outside and just interact with nature and practice those skills as well. So I just wanted to share again what other teachers have said in response to that question.
And speaking of actions, shockingly, we've not solved this entire problem in our webinar. We haven't had a chance to get to all the amazing questions that have come into the Q&A. So I'm going to challenge you to each do about a 1 minute final thought around this question of what. Let's leave people with the same answer, right? Of what is something that people can walk away from this conversation doing, and what are the next steps for those of us who are engaged and involved in climate change education. And obviously, there are lots of different answers to that, and we're not going to give all of them. But I do want to leave people, again, with that sense of some agency. And I'm also going to throw the links to all of our organizations up on the screen. This will be recorded and sent out later as well. So let's see. Alice, why don't you start? So quick as possible.
Okay. Well, as the relatively young person in this room, I think that like I really resonated with what Margaret was just saying about, people saying they're too young to learn about climate change. I think that, first of all, there's so many high schoolers who have done amazing work in climate education who could have easily taken my spot in this webinar. And so I think that like listening to young people is a major step, and also like reaching out and partnering with us and collaborating with us. And also, I think sort of a little bit like believing in us, and that we might not understand, as we might not have the life experience or the education to maybe have like a more nuanced understanding of climate change, although, I don't know. But I think that like we sort of underestimate sometimes how even elementary schoolers can understand such a difficult topic. And so I would just argue, just try it and believe in it. And ideally you can plant some sort of seed for future life later on.
Thank you. Lauren, quick final action plan.
I loved Alice's idea, and it was really similar to where I was going, which makes me really happy to know we're all kind of coming to a full circle. I think take children seriously and take their ideas seriously, and do your best to try and unpack their questions and their worries, and also to ask them for what their ideas for solutions or next steps are. I think the most important thing we can do is have good, honest, real conversations with children. And that's probably the best starting point I can think of.
Margaret, how about you?
Yes, very hard question, but I'm going to piggyback off of what everybody said. I think holding spaces to learn about barriers we're facing when trying to teach about climate change. So it's about what Alice and Lauren said, involve students in a conversation, and then involve teachers in the conversation, because at the end of the day, we need to be able to support both parties to be able to integrate climate change into K through 12. So really just integrating them into the conversation on what they need.
Cool. Yeah, and like I said, this is not the end of this conversation by any means. And there are a lot of folks who are engaged in this work and will be continuing to be engaged in this work of figuring out how we move forward, and that's going to look different in different places. And I think that is also okay. There was somebody in the Q&A asking about, how do we handle mandating teaching climate education in a place where maybe the political system is more volatile, and maybe next year it's going to be different. So it's going to look different in different places. And but I think there are really good minds working on this issue, and I'm really grateful to see how many people have been engaged and interested in this topic today. Like I said, this has been recorded, so will be shared later along with resources. And you've got the websites of all the organizations represented today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we really appreciate all the participants joining us today, and anyone who's watching this in the future. Have a wonderful day, and find a way to listen to some youth, engage some teachers, and figure out how to engage more climate education in your work.